You see what happened here, Mark?
If I can step back actually for
No.
a second, this actually relates to the theme of the topic. How does or can digital the digital age transform scholarship? Well, guess what? Like Google Scholar, I met with the guy who founded Google Scholar. He was a specialist in voice detection, in being able to tell voices apart. Google Scholar can tell your voice, Jacob's voice, apart. Even if you contribute 100 words or a few hundred words to a publication, they can detect your voice because your voice has signals that are unique to you. The way you formulate sentences, the words that you use. So this is happening all over the place. Google Scholar, they're not doing this. It's not like there's a dude somewhere working at Google who's saying like these 30 people, right? Because a lot of people have the same names, the same last names. You might get hundreds of people on a physics publication. How do they keep all those people straight, right? You can use unique identifiers called ORCIDs, which are common now in publishing. But Google can actually tell our voices apart because they know all of our voices that well. They can trace the distinctive signals, cluster them, and show that they're disproportionately present or clustered within our communications. So the big tech companies, they figured this stuff out more than 10 years ago about how to tell voices apart. Again, this is where New Testament scholarship is completely lacking. And, this goes actually to your main, themes. You guys are about debunking myths or exposing myths or just bringing myths into the conversation that we're dealing with, borrowing of myths and broader cross-cultural myths. Well, the biggest myths that are operational in New Testament studies are that 4 dudes wrote the Gospels. That is a myth. And it's only once you debunk that myth that you can start to do science. The other main myth that controls New Testament studies is that Marcion's scriptures are heretical and aberrant, that they are eviscerations. Once you get rid of those 2 myths, everything gets flipped upside down and you can start to do science. So this is where you need to have people like Marcus Vincent on. Jack Bull does this because they're actually doing science in terms of looking at these texts phenomenologically. Mm-hmm. How many times does a word occur? What word is occurring? When does that word first appear? When do these 2 words appear in this combination, right? How frequently in this subsection of a text versus this subsection? How can you start to stratify text, right? The thing, Jacob, you should bring this up with every single person who comes on your show and talks about the synoptic problem. Mm-hmm. Ask them where is the proof scientifically? Can they validate anything that they're saying using statistically significant findings? Or if they just completely left out of why in the sciences, like if you're going to come up with a new COVID vaccine, you damn well have to prove that using quantitative analysis.
Absolutely.
Right? There's no such thing as science without quantitative analysis. You can get a room full of scholars on and they can describe a cloud or a butterfly all that they want. Right? You can have your own pet little theory of butterflies or what a cloud looks like. That's cute. That's not science, right? Scientists dissect the frog. Scientists it's not 10 different dudes or 30 different dudes looking at the frog and coming up with their theory of the frog relationships. They dissect the frog, right? They get into it. They analyze its DNA. They analyze its biochemistry, right? New Testament scholars don't, by and large, vast majority of them, they don't do science. They aren't equipped to do science.
That's the struggle Rick Miller come out.
Is to break through that. We need people who there are tons of data scientists, right? Millions in the world. It's a huge growing area of industry. Undergraduates, graduates, like data science is one of the new like core competencies that a lot of universities are building. Why is the New Testament, why is the study of that series of texts done without any kind of scientific training? Like why are no people in New Testament studies learning how to code in Python or R, right? Those are core competencies that, high school kids now are being asked to do linguistic analysis, to do text mining, to do like trend analysis on like, what are the trend, the trending topics on Twitter. Well, you use computational linguistics, you use Python, you use R, you use other kinds of analyses to do that. But most New Testament scholars, as you mentioned before, they don't even know how to work a computer. We can't expect these people to be able to teach us anything scientific because it's all it really is just idiosyncrasy. So, and I'm not saying this is the beautiful thing about science. One person doesn't speak for science. Like, Bill Nye is a cool guy, and so on. But, science is done by a community, and it's done openly, and it's done in collaboration. So, but, I would love for you guys to ask that every time somebody brings up a synoptic problem solution. Say, where is the statistical proof? Where is your quantitative proof for your theory? And if they don't have it, I'm not saying be mean. I'm just saying like that.
Just take notes. Make sure you're taking notes.
Take notes.
Yeah.
Let me take a look at it.
If we just want to have fun and smoke cigars and sit around and chat about different people's pet theories, that's cool. I mean, but that's fun. But if we want to actually understand like the deep structure of human history, and that's again where you guys are doing important work. But again, like there are myths that are operational even in our assumption. Like the synoptic problem, that in itself is built on a myth. The myth is that there are 3 texts and only 3 texts, and we have to figure out how they're related to each other. That's a myth. Like there are dozens of texts, right? Dozens of collections of data. And then the question is, how do we correlate all of that? How do we make sense of it? How do we stratify it? How do we analyze it synchronically and diachronically? Right. So even the synoptic problem is a myth. There is no such thing as a synoptic problem. There's just human communication.
I find it interesting that it's a problem. I think that's the myth, that it is a problem. It's because we're starting with, well, how do we fix this? It's almost like the diatessaron, Tatian's diatessaron's already set us up for failure here, because we're like, we have a problem here. We have these 3 that have common material. They look similar and they're using each other some way. We know that, but why is it a problem? Well, because there's no way they can all 3 be accurate, historically, reliably true, and in testing what actually happened. That's the problem. And like Rick Miller says, if these aren't historiographies, what's your problem? So you're already starting with creating a problem that there isn't necessarily there. So there's so many myths, I would say, building into this, because if they're not historiography, like Roman biography written as historiography, but rather almost like mythoi, they're just like they're not trying to convey history in any way, shape, or form necessarily, even though all fiction in the ancient world was anchored to verisimilitude. It had anchored to some reality, didn't make it history at all. And so, like, are we starting with the wrong-headed question that it's a like, oh, there's a problem. Why is there a problem? You have 3 different books written for probably 3 different purposes. We don't like, who knows? There's a lot of things that I think, depending on how we start, we're creating problems. But I understand what they're trying to get at. It's trying to figure out who's first and all that. But I'm just throwing it out there because
that
I wonder
assumes unitary authorship and isolation. And what, if we start looking at things in terms of data science, it's what we see is, integrity of voices. Some voices are unique and some voices have distinctive elements, but we also see cross-contamination. If I say something and it actually impacts you guys, or if you say something and it impacts me, or if I read a book and that impacts me, it becomes part of my vocabulary, right? So humans, this kind of gets to the core of the issue, right? What are we as humans? We are synthesizing machines, right? We synthesize signals. We take in signals, we synthesize them, and then we send them out. So what we need to be looking for if we're going to do, signals analysis and data analysis in terms of science is looking at synthetic patterns, and then as well as contamination and things like obfuscation, right? How do you hide your identity as an author? Right, the author of the pastorals, right? Most scholars say that's not written by Paul. How did that person hide that person's literary identity in the guise of Paul? Right. This is where Marcus Vincent's work is about to make a giant impact on scholarship, because along with Jason Badun, he's reconstructed the Apostolicon of Marcion. It turns out it's about 30% of the length of Paul's letters. So if he's right and Jason Badun is right, 70% of what we think is authentic Paul is not. It's not Paul. That's some dude pretending to be Paul, writing under the guise of Paul. Right. Again, we need to be able to do And the way Marcus Vincent's put his together, you know, again, he'll talk about this coming out with Narfranca in July. So he'll be able to go into depth on this. But, you know, it's by doing this careful, scientifically rigorous analysis of vocal patterns and showing that the patterns in the Apostolicon are not only simpler and earlier, but distinct from what you get in the canonical redactor. The canonical redactor loves to throw out names of people, names of places, you know, Marcion's Apostolic, none of that. Like, it doesn't give a care that Paul went here and there and the other place, and then you find the same patterns. Like, so
which makes me wonder. Like,
what we need to look for is patterns in the data, right? Where are the consistent patterns?
Let me throw this out there to you, because recently there's been apologists who want to argue that Acts is just getting so much information accurate about geographic locations where Paul went. And I'm like, well, you know, I've read Pervo, I listened to Dennis McDonald on Acts and stuff, and other scholars who've done this. Shelley Matthews is a great feminist scholar writing commentaries on it. Long story short, like, I think that this author has Paul's letters, but when I say that, I'm not necessarily saying he has all Paul's authentic letters. Like, this author could be writing in the like 130s, you know, AD, and be using a pastoral Pauline letter that isn't actually Paul, that's saying he went to this place, he went to that place. Who knows? They may have somehow worked together in configuring Acts to make the geography work with their pastorals and giving a narrative of Paul. I don't know which came first, the chicken or the egg. You see what I'm trying to get at, right?
Get Marcus Vincent on, ask him that question. What you just said, you know, I can't speak for him, but my guess is he would probably, or Jason Badoon, they would probably agree with you and say what the Marcionite scriptures show is, you know, because there's no interest in all this geography, travel, all that stuff. It's all missing, not only from Marcion's Apostolicon, but also Marcion's Evangelion. So the Orthodox view is, oh, you know, Marcion, the ship owner, he just hated geography so much. He took all that geography stuff out of his, or right, the other way to put it is he's witnessing a more simple and primitive version of this tradition, and then it gets highly rewritten, deeply rewritten, and the canonical Acts and Paul's letters all get rewritten in a go. This is David Trobisch, right? I don't know if you're familiar with his work, but
heard of him.
He basically has argued extensively for 25 years that there was a massive canonical redaction that happened, that around the mid-2nd century, you know, a lot of his publications are in German, but there are some in English. But basically, he says, like, you know, just look at these texts. They're all like tied together. Jack Bull brought this up with the letters, right? In Marcion's Apostolicon, it's all Paul. He's the only author. But in the canonical version, it's Paul and Timothy, Paul and Silas, and Tertius, and right, you get all these co-authors. Well, who are those guys?
Barnabas, you know,
and then those guys all link up with Acts, or they link the letters together with other letters. So that's what Trobisch has shown, is like, you see all these linkages. It's like hyperlinks going on in these texts, but those aren't just like a few random little things. Like, they're all over the place. Like, there is a massive canonical redaction, when we say a Catholic or proto-Orthodox redaction of these texts. So, right, if Badoon and Vincent are right, then people like Bart Ehrman are reading, or James Tabor are reading Paul's letters in their form that comes from around the 140s and treating that as if it comes from the 50s. They're 100 years off,
right? You
know, and they're treating 100% of this Pauline content as if it's Paul, when only 30% is. I'm sorry, it's too much of a tangent. I'm just telling you, like,
in a different way, I was kind of touching on that in some of the older videos about the late dating of Paul, and I wasn't completely dismissing the idea that there was an earlier collection of Paul's letters pre-70, but the letters that in the form that we have, I think a lot of the content in there was added later.
That if you take Badoon's work seriously, or Vincent's work seriously,
I sure do.
There was a lot of content added afterwards. Now, if you just want to say Marcion was a heretic and his scriptures don't matter, or he just cut things up and just like, but
you're playing theology. You're playing theology instead of history.
That's a theological position. Marcion is a heretic. His scriptures are heretical. Therefore, we dismiss them.
And me and Jacob aren't into that. We don't.
Right. But if you actually just look at data patterns, so I encourage you guys to do it for yourselves. Like, just count up every place name. Like, just pick your favorite thing, like place names. Count up how many there are in canonical Luke. Then count up how many there are in Marcion's gospel. And then look at them proportionally. right? And you'll see a massive discrepancy. You can do the same thing with participles. You can do the same thing with, little words. Like you can get fine-tuned in Greek, but you can also, the word people, like that occurs almost 40 times in canonical Luke. It occurs 0 times or one time probably in Marcion's gospel. And if Marcion's gospel is like 7,000 words and canonical Luke is 19,000 words,
right,
the ratio should be like 1 to 3. That's a normal ratio. So if you see that ratio getting way out of whack, where it's like, oh, this is all over the place in canonical Luke, but it's hardly ever there in Marcion's gospel. Either Marcion like just hates participles, just keeps taking out the parts and hates place names. And he just hates that stuff. He hates the word people. Ooh, Marcion hated that word people. Just get rid of that. Ooh, right? So like either you have this theory that Marcion's a redactor who just hates getting rid of all of these really common, deeply integrated features, right? Pros and the accusative. We brought this, Jacob, on our previous, like Marcion's gospel, it's usually like, you see this in Greek, like, Jesus says to, it's in Greek, but in canonical Luke, it's unto, it's pros and the accusative, which occurs every 100 words. And then it turns out if you look at what are, called diachronic language patterns. So again, like getting into a tangent here, but people who study diachronic language development, like n-grams, have frequencies over time, they notice like the dative is disappearing from post-classical Greek as you get into the 2nd century. So what makes more sense? Marcion removed all the pros accusatives and retained all these datives, or the language was evolving to get rid of the dative, and Marcion reflects an earlier time in linguistic development.